All right, folks, in this particular video, we are in fact going to look at lessons 4 and lessons 5. We're going to fuse both of them in one particular video, highlighting Cuba's peak oil crisis and continuing from where we left off. Now, what happened is that in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. And given the fact that Cuba had relatively close relations with the Soviet Union, they too faced the effects, primarily because an embargo was placed upon them prior to that particular period. However, in the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba faced a lot of challenges. These challenges were associated with the acquisition of food, the acquisition of energy. As a result of that, many of their activities, their economic activities, plummeted. Okay, the people were in fact forced to embrace traditional agriculture in an attempt to survive. Now, what happened is that in 1992, an existing embargo was further tightened, right, against Cuba to the point where foreign capital was barred. They basically had limited or little to no access to foreign capital. As a result of that, they relatively had no money, right, no finances to technically weather that particular economic storm. It reached so bad to the point where it was virtually impossible for food production and manufacturing, given energy consumption was limited due to lack of sufficient funds and lack of sufficient energy. All right. The average Cubans lost an estimated 20 pounds by the year 1994. In addition to this, mobility was affected given the fact that there were no fuel to simply power the vehicles to and from particular areas, where the government had to actually import an estimated 1.2 million bikes from China, and they also attempted to manufacture their own, all right, to a relatively large extent. In terms of the agricultural initiatives that were adopted, the community had to actually pool together. All right, there were in fact community training and farming mechanisms involved. Urban land was in fact subjected to conversion to agricultural plots. All right, organic farming was actively involved and vermicomposting as well. In addition to this, rooftop farming became quite pronounced, primarily because there were no energy to simply facilitate proper air conditioning systems within the houses or the homes or even the residential areas. Now, with the progression of time, they eventually were able to survive, right? That was, of course, after many trials where children ranging from 6 to 8 suffered from malnutrition. Many of them died. Hence the reason why the community decided to pool together in that regard. Some farmers even became the highest paid professionals within that particular time. And this was actually driven by necessity. So agriculture was that driver which encouraged them to simply escape potential death or further misfortune. Now, let's move quickly into the technology associated with agriculture, and we must bear in mind that there is, in fact, a universal law which states with the progression of time, technology changes, and most predominantly, it is actually associated with improvement. Now, there are four major criteria when we are talking about technology involved in agriculture: the use of chemical fertilizers or inorganic fertilizers, the use of machinery, which is highly associated with mechanization, scientific breeding, and specific propagation of crops, and last but not least, we have genetic engineering. Now, let's look at the first one: artificial fertilizers. Now, there are in fact certain benefits associated with artificial fertilizers or inorganic chemical fertilizers. You must bear in mind these are in fact not natural. However, they were synthesized, they were manufactured and created in a facility. All right. However, we must also take into consideration that artificial fertilizers are fast acting, they are highly soluble, and given that those two attributes, they can be easily absorbed by plant root systems and taken in by the plants to boost their productivity. However, we must also bear in mind that there are issues associated with inorganic chemical fertilizers. First and foremost, many of these chemical fertilizers may possess a significant degree of toxicity. Some of them in high concentrations might be too pronounced to the point where it may even affect the productivity of uh, edaphic species, which refer to soil-bearing organisms. They can also be displaced or even killed for that matter, given the level of toxicity from pesticides or chemical fertilizers. Also, we must take into consideration that Excessive usage of chemicals can simply be leached from the soils via rainwater, further down the soil column, or even transported via surface flow into unwanted areas, such as waterways. And in many instances, the waterways can be influenced by a greater degree of nutrient content, which can contribute to algae to flourish and bloom in a relatively unnatural way. All right, this is associated with eutrophication, where an abundance of algal bloom can technically encourage sunlight to be impeded. And once sunlight is in fact impeded from the surfaces, plant productivity basically can eventually dwindle. They cannot photosynthesize, especially those aquatic or marine plants. As a result, this adds to a great degree of microbial activity, which eventually contributes to the conditions to become very, very acidic. This can result in biodiversity declines, which is a major issue as well. Now, artificial chemical fertilizers, given the fact that they are fast acting, they can contribute to rapid algal blooms. They also have the potential to alter the pH of the soil as well as altering the pH of the water. Mechanization, as the name suggests, is associated with the use of heavy machinery, and mechanization do possess certain benefits. First and foremost, they are much faster in terms of executing executing tasks than individuals. All right, they don't tire. Yes, they will require maintenance and stuff like that. However, we must bear in mind the time taken for tasks to be completed will be much faster. In addition to this, heavy or bulky work can be expeditiously conducted, to which, over the long term, it can be cost effective, primarily because it can simply replace manual labor, which may have a significant cost over a prolonged period of time. There are, however, certain issues associated with mechanization. First and foremost, they can contribute to soil compaction. Now, heavy machinery, when they simply traverse over the surfaces of soils, they can compact these soils, reducing the aeration from within soils. All right, if soils become less aerated, this can also negatively impact soil macroorganisms such as earthworms and bugs and critters that simply traverse within the subsoil regions. If they are affected, the fertility of soils will be affected because they pass off their waste and stuff like that. In addition to this, if soils become very much compacted, the rates of infiltration or water being absorbed into the soils will become lessened. Obviously, this will contribute to a greater degree of overland flow or runoff, which can also tantamount to a greater degree of soil erosion. And when you have a greater degree of soil erosion, you have nutrient and mineral losses. In terms of scientific breeding, right? Whenever you take into consideration scientific breeding, the concept of breeding here has to do with animals being reared. And when animals are being reared, they are sometimes interbred. In addition to this, the concept or the foundation of scientific breeding technically is associated greatly with artificial insemination. Artificial insemination is much faster than traditional approaches where the actual semen from the male is in fact injected, all right, into the female, obviously by a professional, either a veterinarian or perhaps a very much experienced farmer. All right. In addition to this, it improves productivity to meet population demands because this can be done in a relatively quicker space of time rather than having to wait upon the organisms to simply be in heat or to perhaps produce pheromones that can attract mates, right, which can potentially take too long. The animals can, in fact, be reared for their specific or preferable traits, primarily because I can simply choose which two organisms can be allowed to interact. However, you must bear in mind this is not associated with physical interaction of both organisms. As a matter of fact, the extraction of said semen from an existing male, right, can be taken from a distant area and brought to a particular region where the female exists and injected into the female without having to carry the entire organism to and from. Right, so this is quite beneficial to an extent because it is cost effective. There is in fact a lot less energy involved to actively transport one physical male or female from one location to the next for breeding purposes. All right. There are certain issues, however, that revolves around scientific breeding, and that is associated largely with the fact that the organisms can be, the females that is, can be very much exhausted after consistent breeding. They may not have enough time to recover, given the fact that this is highly in sync with commercial activities, and these females themselves can actually suffer from a great degree of health issues as a result of major stresses that can be imposed. Also, urinary tract infections can be associated if, of course, proper sanitation is not actively involved. The organisms themselves can be subjected to potential death if they are overly exhausted. Now, when we are referring to a specific propagation of crops, we are essentially referring to grafting. And grafting, as the name suggests, refers to the union or the joining of two plants together, right? That is their cuttings, which technically compensate each other. We have the upper part, which happens to be the scion, that is actually joined or was complemented onto the bottom part of a plant, which is already rooted. And that particular part is known as the stalk. All right. The cuttings are essentially placed together. They are wrapped around with seal tight material, ensuring that it is not wet or whatever the case may be. And that union over the progression of time will contribute to two different crops of specific characteristics to simply grow. Eventually, there will be a new shoot being generated within the coming weeks. Now, this at some point is associated with genetic modification, and there are, in fact, many plants that are grafted. Now, the reason why I say this involves genetic modification is because the fruit may possess characteristics belonging to both types of cuttings that were fused together, that were bonded together. All right, so it may genetically possess attributes or characteristics from both of them, or there may in fact be sections of the trees which may possess fruits belonging to individual cuttings, all right, or individual crops that were originally fused together. Now, there are in fact certain issues relating to genetic modification as it relates to grafting. First and foremost, we must bear in mind that modification, we don't know what the effects are, what the effects can be over a prolonged period of time. We don't know because we humans tend to change or alter the dynamics of the environment, much of which are oblivious to us. The effects, that is. All right. Secondly, you must bear in mind that grafting does, in fact, contribute to a new type of fruit that is, in fact, produced from that particular union. And potentially, we might be so fixated upon grafting and creating a different type of crop from the union of two different crops. All right, that is the stalk and the scion being fused together. And essentially, we may even lose the original crop, or the original crop might become very scarce in that regard. For instance, right here in Trinidad, it is very difficult to even acquire the large pomsity, which is the original pomsity. We often see the small pomsity literally everywhere. But what about the large original one? The small pomsity is the grafted pomsity, which bear at a relatively short height. But the large tree basically is in fact very rare, based upon my personal observation. Now, on a lighter note, there are in fact certain types of crops that are genetically modified through grafting, such as the sapodilla and the balata. It is very, very difficult to even propagate balata, right, which grows naturally in the forest, often dispersed by bats and stuff like that. However, farmers today have actually been grafting sapodilla and the balata trees, getting a new different variety genetically modified fruit, which is often relatively sweet. It possesses the characteristics of both trees, but at the same time, this is something that we must consider because we are manipulating it, the effects of which are relatively unknown. Now, in terms of genetic engineering, must bear in mind this is also referred to as recombinant DNA technology. Animals and plants can be genetically modified, or I should say, in this regard, genetically engineered. This is often related to laboratory intensive activities, which involves a great degree of scientific approaches and, of course, a significant amount of monitoring. Right? Of course, funding is quite significant, and this happens to be a major issue. Now, before we jump into the issues related to genetic engineering, we must also bear in mind that It can be utilized positively to improve crop productivity or even encourage the propagation of new fruit or crops or organisms that may potentially be much more resistant to the environmental conditions or climatic extremities in that regard. All right. For example, some crops can be grown that can potentially be resistant, much more drought resistant, or perhaps resistant to pests or even diseases. Now, this scientific approach is highly associated with the organisms to become greatly manipulated at a genetic level. And there are, in fact, certain issues associated with genetic engineering. Now, these issues can be related to environmental, ethical, or even economic concerns. Let's talk about quickly the environmental concerns. The environmental concerns can be associated with the fact that some organisms may be manipulated to the point where it jeopardizes the organism itself and perhaps producing an unwanted threat. Now, we don't know if some of these genetically manipulated or genetically modified or genetically engineered crops can become potentially invasive. In that regard, they may even outcompete existing or natural biota that can produce a lot more harm than good. Some indicate that accidental scenarios can upset the balance of the environment, thus affecting us humans and societies. Now, the reason for such speculations can actually revolve around the fact that for the full implications of genetic engineering or genetic modification at a cellular level is pretty much unknown. Now, in terms of ethical concerns, this can also be related to the ideology where many believe humans has no right to interfere with nature, for this would lead to the disaster, given humanity's track record of altering the physical environment. Nonetheless, scientists are adamant that findings from these research or ventures can actually revolutionize societies worldwide. Now, this is their belief and the main driver as to why they simply decide to move forward as it relates to genetic engineering. Now, there are also economic concerns, right, as it relates to genetic engineering, and this is also related to heavy costs of conducting such experiments because they are largely associated with scientific approaches where many sophisticated technology are in fact involved. Now, many believe that genetic engineering can contribute to an agricultural monopoly, not only at a domestic level, but also at a regional and international level, primarily because those who possess the ideal funding and technology to facilitate such engineering capacities can, in fact, be those who can simply dictate, primarily because they can produce crops or fruits or organisms that can be quite appealing, quite resistant to the elements of the weather or even biotic or abiotic effects. For example, look at grapes, for instance. There are many genetically engineered grapes, as you can see in the world today, and much of them basically don't possess any seeds. How are they expected to be propagated from the fact that they don't possess any seeds whatsoever? Okay, this perspective is critical for those poorer nations which lack adequate funding for such projects and also depend heavily on traditional farming practices to meet their needs. And this is something very important because if agriculture becomes monopolized, what will happen to those small farmers in different developing countries of the world? They will essentially become obsolete. They will become replaced. What will happen to their means of survival? Okay, so let's take this into consideration, please. Now, in terms of, I realize I didn't mention any of the genetic modified or genetically engineered crops. For example, if you look at the groceries today, we can see a variety of tomatoes or tomatoes, whichever one you want to say, and we know for sure many of these crops are genetically modified. As a matter of fact, there are over 700 species of tomatoes in the world. All right. The Belarus and the Fletcher hybrid tomatoes happens to be two particular types that are resistant to the spot wilt viruses. We also have different types of celery, genetically modified celery, certain types of beans, for example, lima beans as well. All right. And also many different types of corn and wheat that happens to be genetically engineered to deal with the changing climatic conditions of the world. All right. All right, folks, I hope this video is actually beneficial. Any questions, feel free to let me know, and we'll continue from next class. All right, you'll have a good one. Bye.